I come to the floor tonight as a United States Senator from Maine. Why am I here to discuss lobsters on the floor of the U.S. Senate? Because my state is facing its most serious crisis, in my view, in my 18 years of public service on behalf of Maine. There is a provision in the bill that we'll be voting on tomorrow that is of vital, critical importance to Maine and I believe the country. In November, a federal court here in Washington issued a ruling under the Endangered Species and the Marine Mammal Protection Act that effectively shuts down the entire Maine lobster fishery in 2 years. It issues requirements that simply can't be met in that time frame. The only choice will be to shut down the fishery. What does that mean? What is the fishery? What is the lobster industry? We talk about the lobster industry. The lobster industry is this guy right here. Thousands of small independent businesses. These boats are not owned by Amazon or Walmart or Whole Foods. They're owned by individual Maine people, families, generations in a town like this. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about the livelihoods of thousands of Maine people that will be cut off by virtue of this decision within 2 years. Is it a real threat? People are already canceling orders for boats. The business of the people that make lobster traps is down 25 or 30%. People are starting to put their boats on the market because they see this closure coming of an industry that's been a mainstay of the Maine economy for 150 years. Well over $1.5 billion a year is based upon this unique, iconic product that comes from the cold waters of Maine. Now, why am I here? Because this decision of the court that effectively closes our lobster industry down is based upon the idea of protecting the North Atlantic right whale, which needs protection. It is indeed an endangered species. The question is whether the remedy, in this case the closure of the Maine fishery, will actually help in the preservation of the right whale. I want to start with a couple of data points. Here's the first. This is the number of right whale deaths ever attributed to Maine lobster gear. 0. The number of right whale deaths attributed to Maine lobster gear, 0. Here's another data point. The number of right whales even being entangled in Maine lobster gear in almost the last 20 years, 0. So the question is there sufficient evidence for this draconian remedy, the shutdown of the entire industry? The other data point is that according to the maps of whale sightings produced based upon data from the Department of Commerce, NOAA, the whales are moving away from Maine. They're congregating now to the far north in the Gulf of St. Lawrence and also around Cape Cod, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But the number of whales sighted and detected along the Maine coast is steadily declining. So, why are we doing this? Why did the court make this ruling? The judge felt compelled by the law because there may be a risk. There may be a risk. Is the lobster industry, is this guy doing anything about that speculative risk? Yes, a lot. Maine lobstermen all mark their gear, so if there's an entanglement and the rope is attached to the whale, you can tell where it came from. They mark their gear. Number two, they have changed all the ropes to become weaker, with weaker ropes, so if there is an entanglement, they'll break. Number three, they put weak links in their ropes, so if there's an entanglement, the link will break and there won't be a problem. By the way, if these entanglements were happening, the lobsterman would know it. Every lobsterman knows where his gear is. They would know if there's an entanglement. And I've talked to lobstermen who've been out there for 30 years and have never seen a right whale in the Gulf of Maine. There may be a few out there, but they've never seen one there. In other words, it's a very, very low risk. And finally, Madam President, they've changed the way they fish. It used to be, and I remember this, you'd have buoys. You've all seen those picturesque, that's a mooring. That's not a lobster buoy, but you have a buoy and a rope that's down to the trap on the bottom. And so every trap had its own line and buoy. That's no longer true. Now they have a buoy, one line, and the traps on the bottom, which are attached so you can pull up a number of traps with only one piece of rope. In the last 10 years, Maine lobstermen have removed 30,000 miles of rope from the Gulf of Maine to mitigate a risk that we're not even sure is there. Now, I've been in environmental policy all my life. I know about the precautionary principle, which means if you're not sure, be careful. And I understand that. I understand if you're not sure, be careful. But this is the precautionary principle run amok, where there's so little evidence and the punishment is so severe. So we're talking, Madam President, about an economic death sentence for an entire way of life, for the town of Stonington, for the thousands, and I mean between 5,000 and 10,000 people that work on the water and thousands more that work in processing and involved in this industry, over $1.5 billion a year of economic impact in the state of Maine. But if you were in court and you said, we're going to impose an economic death sentence, well, here's the way the law looks at things like that. If it's a criminal case to take away somebody's liberty beyond a reasonable doubt, no beyond a reasonable doubt in this case, it's not even close to a reasonable doubt, beyond a reasonable doubt. Okay, in a civil case, you have to prove your case by a preponderance of the evidence. It's more likely than not. Is there a preponderance of the evidence that the Maine lobster fishery is causing or contributing significantly to the loss of right whales? No, there's no preponderance of the evidence. How about any evidence? Zero. Zero. Now, a solution to this crisis is in the bill that we'll be voting on tomorrow. It's one that the Maine delegation, myself and Senator Collins, Congresswoman Pingree, Congressman Golden have been working on since this decision. And what it is a compromise that's been negotiated between the various people interested in this issue in this body that leaves in place all of those protective measures that I mentioned, the weak links, the weaker ropes, the ropes out of the water, the marking of the gear, all those stay in place. Importantly, it provides funding for two purposes. One is the development of gear that will reduce the risk even further, lobster gear, that is. For example, there's a lot of discussion of something called ropeless fishing, which would be traps on the bottom and a buoy on the bottom that can be released by a radio signal, come to the surface, and then you can pull the traps up so there's no rope in the water. Now, that's a great idea. The problem is it's not ready for prime time. It's being tried. There's experiments going on with it. There's some serious problems with it. For example, currently, if you're a lobsterman, you go out and you see other buoys, and that tells you where the other traps are, so you don't put yours down on top of theirs. If in this ropeless fishing configuration, until we figure that out, we can't have multiple traps laying on top of each other and becoming entangled. The other problem is it's very expensive. We're talking about tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars for the guy that owns this boat. So what the bill provides is funding for research of how to develop, whether it's ropeless fishing or some other technology that we don't know right now, to mitigate whatever risk there is even further. So that's one funding in the bill. The other funding is for data to know where the whales are. To know, because the problem is, what data we have indicates there are practically none along the Maine coast. But we don't know that for sure. But again, what we're doing is sentencing this industry to death, economic death, without the information upon which that decision should be made. And I'm very comfortable, I'm anxious to work on that data, whether we do it by satellite, by drones, by acoustics, whatever we do, I want to know where those whales are. I don't think, based upon the data I've seen, that we're going to see there are many in the area where the lobster fishing takes place. But I'm willing to get the accurate answer to that. So the bill does those two things, funding for research and funding for data collection. The third thing it does is pause the economic death sentence. It pauses the ruling that says this has to be finished in 2 years, because that means the lobster industry, the lobster fishing, the lobster families, the lobster towns are finished within 2 years. We're talking about a 6-year pause as time to collect the data and develop the gear. Now, even the advocates, the people that are angry about what we're doing and making wild charges that this is going to immediately lead to the extinction of the whales, which is just no basis for that, even those people concede that it's going to take 6 to 10 years to develop these alternatives. What do they expect the people of Maine to do between year 2 and year 10 when their whole livelihoods have gone away? So what we're doing, what we compromised, was a 6-year period that will give us time to develop the technology and to develop the data, and we may find that there are different solutions, or that the data may show no additional restrictions beyond what is already being done are necessary. Madam President, I've been involved as an advocate for environmental policy all my adult life. I was the first full-time lobbyist for the Maine environmental community in 1976. I helped to write the Maine billboard law, the Maine bottle bill, subdivision laws. I advocated, interestingly, one of the bills I advocated for was right turn on red. Why is that an environmental bill? Because if you're not idling at a gas station, multiply that by millions of people across the country, a big saving in fossil fuel and pollution going into the atmosphere. That was, believe it or not, an environmental issue in the 1970s. When I was governor of Maine, one of my proudest achievements is the fact that we put more land into conservation in Maine during my 8 years as governor than during the entire prior 175 years of Maine combined. More land into conservation than in the prior 175 years combined, and it wasn't by accident. It was something that I felt deeply engaged in when I began as governor. In 1987, long before I was governor or in politics, I was the chair of a group that brought the Land for Maine's Future into being, which was I think it was the second in the country to have a public bond issue for land conservation. This was an initiative that I took on as a private citizen. And so I have been involved in these issues. Here's one more data point. This was my rating by the League of Conservation Voters last year, 100%. So if somebody says, you know, I don't care about the environment or the whales, that isn't true. Madam President, I work every day at Edmund Muskie's desk. My office found Senator Muskie's desk, and it's in my office today. They found it in a storage room somewhere here. And Edmund Muskie is literally the father of the modern environmental movement. The Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, he brought to this body. The Clean Air Act, by the way, passed this body unanimously. Can you imagine that? We can't agree on what time it is around here unanimously. Edmund Muskie's heritage of the invention, the creation of the environmental movement in this country is one of Maine's proudest achievements. That Ed Muskie was the guy that began that process here in this body some 50 years ago. I sit at his desk. I think about his legacy. And one of his legacies was, how do you talk about these issues? The big argument in Maine when Muskie was talking about protecting clean water and clean air was payrolls versus pickerel. That was the, do we have to choose between payrolls, between jobs and fish? Muskie's answer was no, that's a false choice. We can protect the environment, but we can also understand economic impacts and find ways to navigate whatever potential conflicts there may be. That's Muskie's legacy. We don't have to choose between lobsters and whales. We don't have to choose between the men and women of Stonington or Cutler or Korea or Georgetown or Freeport or Cape Elizabeth and whales. We just have to be sensible about approaching this in a way that will protect the whales, but also protect the way of life of these wonderful people. That's why I'm here tonight. That's what we've done in this bill. It is in no way a diminution of the standards of the Endangered Species Act or the Marine Mammal Protection Act. It merely pauses that economic death sentence until we have time to know how to navigate the solution and what the real definition of the problem is. To me, Madam President, that's good policy. It's what we should do here on all the complicated issues we face. It's an unbelievable honor and humbling to represent the state of Maine in this body. And I'm proud of the fact that we've been able to confront this issue in a way that will enable the lobsters and the lobster fishers and the whales to exist in an ecosystem that's protective of people as well as whales. This is the role that we have here, and I believe we've achieved it in this bill. I can't leave without thanking my colleague, Senator Collins, who was instrumental in working the language that we'll have before us tomorrow, and my colleagues, Congresswoman Pingree and Congressman Golden in the House, and all the people in these two bodies who we have worked with to achieve this important piece of legislation. Madam President, this is the way we can make good policy, based upon data, science, facts, and common sense. And that's what we've achieved here today. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.